G'day trendsetters, welcome to episode 2 of the Wabi podcast. Today I'd like to explore the topic, is the tea ceremony without tea still a tea ceremony? Or more specifically, is a Japanese tea ceremony without matcha still a Japanese tea ceremony? What do you reckon? Polish the floor, get a tea, and tune in. So just be a bit more specific about what I'm talking about, give you some examples of what's out there. So for whatever reason, say matcha's not available, or you can't have caffeine, or you want to offer guests something different, some things that you can replace matcha with would be another powdered beverage. So for instance, in South America, you have mate. You can bring that down into a powder. It still has a lot of caffeine, and you can make that into a beverage that resembles matcha in the Japanese tea ceremony. Or say for the non-caffeine, you might have something like mulberry leaf tea, or mugwort tea, or tochu tea. You can make all of these three things into something that resembles matcha, some more than others depending on how much foam that they give. So things like this, if you would take the matcha, which is Camellia sinensis, that's ground into powder, replace that with something else, does the Japanese tea ceremony still remain the Japanese tea ceremony? So the kind of things we need to explore are identity and change, intention and interpretation, and also essentialism and tradition. So for identity and change, one of the things that comes to mind first of all is the ship of Theseus paradox, which I learnt in good old metaphysics class at university. So this paradox goes that when Theseus came back from slaying the Minotaur, he parked his boat in the port at Athens, and because he was such a bloody legend from eliminating this problem of having to send 7 fine men and women every 7 years to be eaten by the Minotaur, they left the ship there as a display of the heroism of Theseus. But after a while, some of the planks in the boat needed replacing, and if you replace those planks over time, does it remain the same ship of Theseus, or does it change? So to simplify it, of course you've got other components of the ship, like the sails and the masts and the rudder and anchor and all that sort of jazz. But if you just take the planks, for example, say that's made up of 1,000 planks, and you replace one plank in the ship every year. Now, if all the planks are replaced, is it the same ship of Theseus? Some people might say yes, some people might say no. And if some people say no, well, at what point does it cease to become the original ship of Theseus and change into something different? Is it at plank 1? If you change anything, can you not then define it as the ship of Theseus? Or say after you change 100, does it cease to become the ship of Theseus and something else? Or is the number 563 or 842? Or is it 999? Where's the point? It's very subjective. The answer will be different depending on the person. So this paradox forces us to confront the complexities of identity and the inherent subjectivity of our understanding. But in the case of the Japanese tea ceremony, does the same thought experiment apply? So if you take all the parts of a Japanese tea ceremony composed of, say, the hishaku bamboo ladle, the kettle that boils the water, or the charcoal that heats the water, the chashaku, the tea scoop that scoops the tea, and the matcha, do all these parts have equal value? Do they have equal value if you take one of the parts and replace it with a substitute material? So take the example of replacing the anchor of the ship of Theseus with a plastic one. You're not going to be able to stay in the same place. And say you replace matcha with something that's not tea, but is another substance that you can drink. Is tea still going to have the same feeling and effect? Is the gathering going to still have the same function? To try and elucidate this a little bit more, before we get into unpacking the specifics of matcha, take the example of a 100-metre sprinter, the world record holder, and say this person has the lower part of their leg replaced by an artificial limb. Now, they still might be able to run bloody fast, but they're probably not going to keep under the 10-second barrier. Or we'll take a soccer match. Say you have the mighty Olympique de Marseille taking on Paris PSG. And at half-time, you take the ball and replace the soccer ball with a rolled-up ball of rags taped together with some masking tape. Let them go at it for the second half. Now, it might retain some comical value for a little while, but after a while it's going to get a bit tedious, and the crowd are really not going to get what they come for, and they're certainly not going to come back and watch it the next week if they're going to play with that same ball. So this raises the question of intention and interpretation. So while the intention to play a soccer match is still there, the interpretation of the crowd is not going to be the same as when you're playing with a real soccer ball. And so for matcha, if you replace it with something else, even though the intention of the host may be to conduct a successful tea gathering, the interpretation of the guest that doesn't get the matcha that they know and have come to love and adore and cherish might not still take away the same impression after the tea gathering. And then what goes on from that is whether the host and guest, after losing something of the magic of the Japanese tea ceremony that they know and love, will they continue to do it in this manner, or can they sustain doing it in this manner over time? Example would be Bernard Engelman. What a bloody legend. Green Tea Blue Sky. What a fantastic name for an Instagram account and a side matcha business. So he did a beer tea ceremony for his metalhead mates. He's got mates that are into a lifestyle of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and he wants to bring them in to his tea passion and try and bridge that radical world with another radical world, because tea people are hardcore too. And the way he did it was to try and devise a ceremony with some of the look and feel of his beloved Japanese tea ceremony, but crack a beer and serve a beer after purifying it and give it to his mates. Now, this has a fantastic novel effect and it was a very beautiful thing to behold, but does it have the staying power as if you're using matcha in the sense that it's used in the Japanese tea ceremony? And what's that sense? The sense is to induce a calm, introspective, meditative effect in the tea room with your guests. Because it's a substance, it's made of different molecules that affect us chemically, and that's going to affect our consciousness. So while alcohol might make us relaxed and a little bit happy, cheerful, and also very talkative, the matcha is going to make us more introspective, calm, meditative, and serene. So can other things do this? Well, they might. If you take the alcohol out of the equation and replace the beverage with another powdered substance that you can ingest and prepare like matcha, you've got things like I mentioned before, Mugwort Tea, mulberry tea, and tochu. And also I should mention mate. So take mate. It's got caffeine in it. You can prepare it as you do matcha, but one of the things that it loses is the foam or the mousse that you prepare when you make matcha. So you do all this lovely ceremony, but the end result is sort of this dirty green pool of water. So it really doesn't have that same magic that matcha has when it's prepared with that lovely foam on top and that beaming green. But when you ingest mate, you're still going to get some of the psychological effects that you do when you have matcha, i.e. the caffeine is going to stimulate your system and you'll have an intensified concentration that matcha gives you. Or say for some ungodly reason you have to use a non-caffeine alternative when you're doing your tea. Now if you're practicing by yourself and it's late at night before bed and you want to get a good practice in as well as a good night's sleep, well then when you're practicing by yourself, why not replace the matcha with tochu or mugwort tea or mulberry tea? Like, it's just you, yourself, and thou, and you know the magic of your practice. Like, you don't need to communicate to somebody or share the Japanese tea ceremony in a participatory environment. But when it's across people, when you need to communicate, when you need to share the Japanese tea ceremony with another person, can this successfully be done with something that's not tea, with one of these non-caffeine alternatives? Well, tochu is quite healthful for the body. It's great for athletes, but it certainly doesn't have caffeine, L-theanine, or saponin, which is the molecule which allows matcha to froth and foam. But if you take mulberry tea is very interesting because Eisai talks about mulberry tea in his Kissa Yojoki, which is the first Japanese treatise on tea. It can be translated as drinking tea for health and well-being, something along the lines of that. And the treatise is not just on Camellia sinensis, the tea plant that is our matcha. He also talks about mulberry tea, or kucha in Japanese. So kucha seems, historically, to have a lot going for it as a non-caffeine alternative for matcha. But unlike mugwort tea, which I'll talk about in a second, it doesn't froth up and retain that mousse that matcha does. So just like in the case of mate, even though you go through this lovely ceremony and bring this beverage to fruition through a meditative, considered, thoughtful practice, at the end of the day, you're passing over something to somebody that's a little bit dirty, green, snotty water kind of vibe. It doesn't have that same magic that matcha does in the beautiful presentation of this beverage. But mugwort tea does. Mugwort tea is also a vivid green powdered beverage that you can whisk up, and it also has a lot of saponin in it, so it has that lovely foam that matcha has, and it retains the foam. So whereas tochu will froth up, the bubbles disappear in quite a short time as compared to matcha and mugwort tea. But again, it's missing something. The caffeine. So sorry people that can't have caffeine, there's something to this. It's actually the interplay between caffeine and L-theanine and the addition of saponin for the beauty element that makes matcha so magical. And on this point, I'd like to talk about essentialism and tradition. So when you think about what caffeine does, it stimulates your nervous system. So it gives you that sense of clarity and your brain starts ticking over quicker. But L-theanine, it counteracts the stimulative effect because it's a deep relaxant. So unlike coffee that brings you up very quick, the L-theanine in tea sustains that stimulation over a long period of time. So you have a calm, concentrated stimulation. And the saponin is also an interesting molecule. And for Latin geeks, you might have picked up on sapon, or French speakers will know savon, which is soap. And that's exactly what it is. It's the component in soap that interacts with water to create a foam. And this is found in tea. So if you think about what soap does, it purifies and it cleanses. And there's something about tea which you feel like you're being cleansed on the inside. And I certainly know that when I do my morning tea practice and I have some matcha, the first thing I want to do after leaving the tea room is not go and have breakfast. It's want to get rid of all the impurities that are lingering on in my body from the day before, if you know what I mean. This ties into the values of tea ceremony because one of the core values of tea ceremony is purity. So it kind of links in to the chemical effect on the body, because the chemical effect on the body links into the transformative value that we see in our tea practice. And for the interaction of caffeine and L-theanine too, this is a perfect aid to meditation practice. And so here we have tradition. Zen Buddhism is a very protocol-rich practice towards personal transformation. And when you think of the core practice, it's sitting and meditating. And there's a lot of meditation in Zen Buddhist monastic life. If you have an aid to meditation rather than just fight the nods, having a tea break in between your meditation practice can stimulate your system without putting it into overdrive by having the L-theanine kick in to have a nice, calm, sustained stimulative effect and lasting concentration, so you can really get into your meditation practice for these long periods of time, which is required in Zen Buddhism. And then the tradition or the protocol of monastic life would then influence the preparation of the tea, and vice versa. So you're having this etiquette and the procedures that are practiced in Zen monasteries starting to imbue into the way that the tea is prepared. So the way that the tea is prepared becomes ritualized. And then the tea enhances the ritual practice. and vice versa. So there's something in matcha and Camellia sinensis, the tea plant, that enriches Zen practice, and Zen practice enriches the preparation of tea. So with matcha and the Japanese tea ceremony, what you can see is a beautiful friendship of the parts, and some of the most striking relationships come from things which seem absolutely unrelated. And when you think about it, tea, Zen Buddhism, at first seems completely unrelated. Then think of other things that are metaphors of something seemingly completely unrelated but are strikingly beautiful when they're put together. So say a kangaroo jumping over a coarse rock face. Extremely beautiful image. Or say Zen Buddhism again, with post-war American art. Seemingly unrelated, but look at John Cage's music, something profoundly beautiful, which links seemingly completely different worlds. Or some examples from contemporary culture. Take Johnny Cash and 9 Inch Nails, the song Hurt. Or Run DMC and Aerosmith, hip-hop and metal. Mesh them together and you get Walk This Way, absolute smash hit. Or take Grace Jones and Citroën, the French car company. What legendary commercials that collaboration produced. Or Faith No More, covering the Bee Gees, particularly the film clip for I Started a Joke, or The Joke, is particularly memorable. Seemingly unrelated genres, but put them together and they produce something of incredible beauty. Or take MIA, the controversial musician, and her latest album, and conversion to born-again Christianity. Produce something of incredible beauty. And also Japan and baseball. What a Marriage Made in Heaven. And also Foreigners and the Japanese tea ceremony. When you mash up seemingly completely unrelated worlds, sometimes you get things of incredible beauty. Film is a really good example of this because you think of the soundtracks and how they bring those moving images to life. Think of what the scene would be like if there was no Imperial March playing in the background when Darth Vader's in the house. It would lose something. They would have far less impact and sometimes even appear absurd. And you probably know when you're putting up an Insta story and you have a clip of video and you want to match a piece of music to it, there's some pieces of music that just work and really evoke the essence and the thrust and the meaning of what's behind that image. But other music just doesn't work and it doesn't do anything for the moving image that you're trying to communicate. So there's this dynamic interplay between the form, which is, in the case of the Japanese tea ceremony, the form of the tea ceremony, and the temai and the way that we prepare the tea and structure a tea gathering and welcome guests, and the essence, which is encapsulated in the matcha and the chemical effect that this has on people. So this essential element of the effect of matcha and the formal element of wrapping it in a meditative temai that have a dynamic interplay which produces the Japanese tea ceremony that we know and love. And that's where the magic is. So if you take something out that is essential, like matcha, does it still retain the force of tradition that we know as the Japanese tea ceremony? Of course, there are a lot more other elements in the Japanese tea ceremony, like arranging art and telling a story with your selection of art pieces to create a theme and invite guests into your room and serve them a meditative beverage over a structured, curated presentation of your temai and the artworks. And of course, this can have a long life. But if you're missing that essential effect on human consciousness, is it going to retain the relevance over time? This is an addition that I'm making while editing the podcast, which is something very crucial on the subject of, is the Japanese tea ceremony still the Japanese tea ceremony without matcha? And it's the fact that the Japanese tea ceremony owes its existence to matcha. This is because the practice of Zen found an expression outside of the monastery through tea. The mind state of Zen was able to be transferred onto an everyday activity like preparing tea. And because tea was not limited to Zen circles, it was also practiced in the lay world, that allowed the Zen mind state to also transcend its own borders of the monastery and spread to other parts of society and retain some of its philosophical thrust and start to merge with worlds like art and poetry. So therefore, if you want to place the emphasis on origins, the Japanese tea ceremony is not a Japanese tea ceremony without matcha because it owes its very existence to matcha, which is a kind of a no-brainer because it's the Japanese tea ceremony. But what I'm saying is that the Japanese tea ceremony could not have been an art form if the beverage that was in use was mugwort tea or tochu tea or mulberry tea. The idea or the mind of Zen does not find a shape, doesn't find a molecular composition that perfectly matches the pursuit of Zen. It has to be tea. The Zen arts and philosophy are like the oxygen that feeds the tea's fire, and that fire illuminates that greater mind. And together they give a fullness of expression that we know as the Japanese tea ceremony. And again, we have radically different worlds, as in a lay practice of preparing and drinking tea, and a very exclusive practice of Zen monastic life that came together, these two worlds smashed together and birthed something that has had great longevity and is revered as one of the pinnacles of human culture. And I'm not saying that you can't practice the Japanese tea ceremony without matcha. I'm simply saying that there is a real question of the longevity of the practice if you practice without matcha. For a personal practice it might work, but whether it can be a sustained communal practice with other people, the effect of the matcha on human consciousness is quite an essential ingredient for the longevity of the practice and to bring the art and the philosophical elements to their fullest expression. So that's the tea for today. It'd be bloody awesome if you could sign up to my Patreon, either free or paid, so you get on the mailing list and get a notification of when this podcast comes out. You can also check out my website, buy some tea if you want a matcha now from my website. I'll put the link in the description. And also, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube version of this podcast so you also get a notification of when it comes out. And if you don't want to, don't. The most important thing is that you listened. I thank you very much. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you next time.